These photographs tell two very different stories, Marcus wrote in the exhibition text. The story that enslavers desperately wanted to tell, that slavery was actually benign and enslaved people were content in their situation, and the undeniable truth that the photographs couldn't fully hide, that slavery was violence, that it irreparably damaged every single person it touched, and that the survivors carried its very visible marks for their entire lives. 1 year after Marcus initially found the photograph, the Equal Justice Initiative organized a memorial service for Samuel Rose. It was held in Charleston, in a park that had once been a part of the Hartwell Plantation's extensive land holdings. Over 200 people attended the memorial service, including historians, activists, descendants of enslaved people, and even a few descendants of enslavers who were finally willing to acknowledge their families' histories honestly and openly. Grace spoke at the service, reading from a prepared statement that her family had worked on together. Samuel Rose was born into slavery around 1845, she began, her voice resonating with both strength and dignity. He was forced to labor from the moment he was physically able to walk. He was shackled as a small child for the perceived crime of simply seeking freedom from his bondage. He was sold away from his home at the tender age of 11 and never saw South Carolina ever again. But he survived the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction, and the horrors of Jim Crow. He lived a full 78 years, despite a brutal system that was specifically designed to destroy him in every way. And he made absolutely sure that his descendants would know his harrowing story, would always remember his name, and would fully understand exactly what had been done to him and what he had somehow managed to survive. For 140 long years, the photograph of Samuel with William and Charlotte Hartwell was misinterpreted as nothing more than a charming image of simple childhood innocence. But our family knew the real truth all along, that Samuel had actually been in chains while that photograph was being taken, that his smile was completely coerced, and that every single moment of his childhood spent with the Hartwells was defined by unspeakable violence and brutal captivity. But no one in the wider world ever listened to our oral history. It took a sharp researcher finally noticing the scars that were on Samuel's wrists for the truth to finally be acknowledged and validated. This is precisely why we absolutely must preserve these difficult histories, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. This is why we must look very closely and critically at historical images that may seem innocent on the surface, and always ask whose stories are being erased and ignored. This is why we must believe the descendants of enslaved people when they so bravely tell us their family histories, even when those very histories directly contradict comfortable narratives about the past that some people want to cling to. Samuel Rose unequivocally existed. He absolutely mattered as a human being. He was a person, not a piece of property. He had a loving mother who cared deeply for him, a full and meaningful life that extended far beyond his years of enslavement, and countless descendants who proudly carry his memory forward into the future. The Hartwell family tried their hardest to erase him from the historical record. They never once used his name in their official records. They cruelly sold him away from his home and family. They celebrated their own version of history while simultaneously denying his very humanity. But he bravely survived it all. We survived as well. And we're all here today to say his name out loud, to honor his remarkable life, and to ensure with every fiber of our beings that he's never forgotten ever again. Marcus then unveiled a memorial marker that would be permanently installed in the park for all to see. It was simple in its design, yet incredibly powerful in its message. A slab of black granite carefully engraved with Samuel's full name, his dates of birth and death, and a brief, but very poignant inscription. Enslaved as a child on this very land, shackled and sold, but never broken in spirit, and forever remembered by those who proudly carry his story forward. Below the inscription was a reproduction of the famous 1854 photograph, the three children all seated on the garden bench. However, unlike the original photograph, which had intentionally attempted to conceal the terrible truth, this reproduction included very clear arrows pointing directly to Samuel's wrists, along with text that read, "The marks you see here are scars that are from shackles. This young child was enslaved. His name was Samuel Rose." After the deeply moving ceremony, Marcus stood with Grace, both of them gazing silently at the memorial. The land around them had changed so dramatically since Samuel's own childhood. The plantation buildings were long gone, replaced by suburban developments and this small, unassuming park. But the difficult history remained, now indelibly marked in a way that could simply no longer be ignored by anyone. "Do you think he would be satisfied with this?" Marcus asked quietly, breaking the silence. "With the memorial we've erected, with the exhibition that's telling his story, and with his story finally being told and acknowledged?" Grace carefully considered the question, her loving gaze fixed on the memorial. Samuel lived his entire adult life fighting tooth and nail to be seen as a fully realized human being, to have his deeply painful and traumatic experiences finally acknowledged by the world, she replied, her voice filled with a quiet strength and resolve. He faced countless people who blatantly denied that slavery had been cruel and inhumane, who stubbornly insisted that enslaved people had actually been content with their lot in life, who erased and minimized and desperately tried to justify the violence that had been done to him and countless others. This memorial accomplishes exactly what he spent his entire life trying to do. It insists on the unvarnished truth. It names him. It fully acknowledges what was done to him as a small child. So, yes, I sincerely think he would find at least some small measure of peace in all of this. She paused thoughtfully, her eyes lingering on the photograph that was on the memorial. 8-year-old Samuel with shackle scars clearly visible on his wrists, forced to smile insincerely for the camera. She continued softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I also sincerely think he'd want people to understand that simply remembering the past isn't nearly enough. These dark histories aren't just something that happened a long time ago. They created systems and inequalities that sadly persist to this very day." Samuel's story matters not just because he suffered so greatly, but because fully understanding precisely how slavery worked, how it was disguised and callously justified, and how it has damaged generations of Black families, is absolutely essential to finally addressing its devastating and ongoing legacy in our modern world. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his mind already racing with all the important work that still remained to be done in the future. The thousands upon thousands of photographs yet to be examined closely and critically, the millions upon millions of enslaved people whose names had been deliberately erased from the historical record, and the vibrant and resilient descendant community that was still tirelessly fighting for long overdue acknowledgement and justice for their ancestors. But today, in this singular moment, Samuel Rose was finally being remembered and honored for the first time. His face looked out from the memorial, no longer forced to smile for the cameras, no longer erased from history, and no longer condemned to be silent and unheard. The very same photograph that had been originally created to hide the brutal truth of slavery had finally become, through careful attention to detail, persistent research, and the unwavering voice of his proud descendants, a powerful testimony to that very truth. Samuel had finally reached across 170 long years through that powerful image, meticulously preserved in silver and glass. His scars, which were visible to anyone who chose to look closely and carefully enough, had finally told their incredibly compelling story to the world. And that long-suppressed story had finally, and irrevocably, changed absolutely everything for the better. This seemingly innocent photo of 3 children holds a hidden truth, one that experts painstakingly uncovered. The Charleston Antique Shop was saturated with the scent of old wood mixed with the biting, stale odor of mothballs. Marcus Williams, a researcher for the Equal Justice Initiative, had been sifting through estate sale acquisitions for over an hour when a small daguerreotype caught his eye. It was tucked away behind a collection of Depression-era glassware in a tarnished silver frame. Marcus's work with the EJI, which is dedicated to documenting the ongoing legacy of slavery in America, had given him a keen eye for spotting images that told stories beyond what was immediately apparent. This photograph in particular made him stop in his tracks. 3 children, probably between 8 and 10 years old, were sitting together on an ornate garden bench. 2 of them were white, a boy and a girl, each with blonde ringlets. They were seated on either side of a Black child in the center. All 3 wore expensive clothing. The white boy had on a tailored suit and a bow tie, and the girl was wearing a fancy dress decorated with lace. The black child was dressed just as well, in a clean white shirt, a dark vest, and trousers that matched the white boy's. The three children were smiling, and their smiles looked real, not the forced, formal smiles common in 1850s photography. They were sitting close together, which suggested they were comfortable and familiar with each other. The white girl had her hand on the black child's shoulder, and the white boy was leaning in slightly, as if they had all been laughing just before the photo was taken. At first glance, it looked like a heartwarming picture of childhood friendship that transcended the racial divisions of the antebellum South, an image that suggested children were innocent enough to ignore their parents' prejudices. However, Marcus had learned through experience not to take such images at face value. He carefully picked up the frame and examined it in the shop's poor lighting. The back of the photograph had a date in faded ink, summer 1854, Charleston. A photographer's stamp read Whitmore Studios. Marcus looked closely at each child's face. The white children seemed relaxed and happy, but Marcus noticed that the black child's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something else there, something hard to describe, maybe a hint of weariness, or a deep-seated fear hidden behind a forced smile. Then Marcus spotted it. The black child's sleeves had slid up a bit on both arms. Around each wrist, barely visible in the photograph's sepia tones, were marks, discolored bands of skin that indicated long-term chafing. Marcus had seen similar marks in other historical photographs and documents. They were the unmistakable signs of shackles worn for a long time. Marcus's hands started to tremble. This wasn't a picture of three friends playing. It was something much more disturbing, a carefully staged image that documented a horrible reality while trying to create an illusion of harmony and affection. He bought the photograph for $30 and went straight to his car. He sat in the parking lot and examined the picture again in better light, using his phone's camera to zoom in on the details. The marks on the wrists were undeniable. Now that he was paying closer attention, he noticed other things. The black child was sitting slightly forward on the bench, as if he were ready to stand up at any moment. Despite the smile, his posture was subservient. His clothes, while expensive, were a little too big, possibly hand-me-downs or bought without proper fitting. This child was enslaved. Marcus was sure of it. He was dressed in fine clothes and posed with his enslaved children as if they were equals, but he was marked by the chains that revealed his true status. Marcus felt an urgent need to find out who these children were, what had happened to them, and why someone had taken this particular photograph. He started his car and drove back to his office in Montgomery, Alabama, already planning the research that would consume the next several months. Back at the Equal Justice Initiative's research center, Marcus placed the daguerreotype under bright lights and photographed it from every angle. The digital images revealed details that were impossible to see with the naked eye. The marks on the black child's wrists were even more obvious under magnification, bands of lighter skin, about an inch wide, on each wrist, with faint scarring along the edges. Marcus had documented similar injuries in his research. Enslaved children who were shackled, either as punishment, to prevent them from escaping, or just as a show of power, developed these distinctive marks. The skin would lighten where metal constantly rubbed against it, and scar tissue would form where the shackles chafed during movement or struggles. He started with the photographer's mark, Whitmore Studios, Charleston, 1854. Historical directories showed that Edward Whitmore had a successful photography business in Charleston from 1851 to 1863, catering to wealthy families who could afford the expensive daguerreotype process. Whitmore had advertised family portraits of distinction and children's likenesses captured with artistic sensitivity. Marcus found many examples of Whitmore's work in archives and museum collections. The photographer had a unique style, outdoor settings whenever possible, natural poses, careful attention to clothing, and background details that emphasized his subject's wealth and status. Many of his portraits included enslaved servants in the background, positioned to highlight the family's prosperity. But this photograph was different. The enslaved child wasn't in the background. He was in the center, between the white children, and dressed just as well as they were. This wasn't about showing off wealth through the number of servants. It was something else entirely. Marcus contacted colleagues at the Charleston Museum and the South Carolina Historical Society, sending them high-resolution images of the photograph. 2 days later, he received a response from Dr. Patricia Green, a historian specializing in antebellum Charleston families. "I think I've identified the white children," Patricia's email began. "The clothing style and the Whitmore Studios connection led me to prominent Charleston families from 1854. I found a matching photograph in our collection, a formal family portrait taken the same year showing the Hartwell family, Colonel James Hartwell, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 children, William and Charlotte. The children in your photograph are definitely William and Charlotte Hartwell." Marcus's heart raced. The Hartwell family, he knew that name. Colonel James Hartwell was one of Charleston's richest plantation owners, with over 2,000 acres of land and, according to the 1850 census slave schedule, 187 enslaved people. But here's what's interesting. Patricia's email continued. "I found a reference to this specific photograph in Eleanor Hartwell's diary, which was donated to our archives in the 1920s. She mentions commissioning Whitmore to photograph the children at play with their little companion. She doesn't name the black child, but she says he was always with them and that William and Charlotte were quite attached to the boy." There was something deeply unsettling about how casually she discussed this, as if it was perfectly normal for her children to play with an enslaved child while that child wore shackles. Marcus requested copies of Eleanor Hartwell's complete diary. When the scanned pages arrived, he spent 2 days reading entries from 1852 to 1856, searching for any mention of the black child in the photograph. Eleanor wrote about her children often, their lessons, their health, their social development, and she mentioned the boy in dozens of entries, always without using his name. Eleanor Hartwell's diary painted a disturbing picture of how enslaved children existed in the lives of wealthy white families, simultaneously present and invisible, valued and completely disposable. Marcus compiled every reference to the boy who appeared in the photograph with William and Charlotte. March 1853. William has become quite fond of the boy from the quarters. James says it's natural for children to play together, and the boy is well-behaved and clean. I've told Mammy to make sure he's properly dressed when he comes to the house. July 1853. Charlotte is insisting that the boy join her lessons. I've allowed it, although of course he can't learn to read or write. That would be illegal and dangerous. But he sits quietly while she practices her letters, and his presence seems to encourage her to study. December 1853. The boy tried to run away last week. James was quite disappointed. We've treated him well, given him privileges that are unusual for someone of his position. James had him punished appropriately and fitted with restraints to prevent future incidents. The children were upset to see it, so I explained that discipline, while unpleasant, is necessary for the boy's own good and for the safety of our family. Marcus felt sick reading these entries. The restraints Eleanor mentioned so casually were the shackles that had left marks on the child's wrists, marks that were still visible in the photograph taken 6 months later. January 1854. The boy has gotten used to his restraints. He doesn't struggle against them anymore and has gone back to his usual cheerful behavior with the children. William asked why the boy has to wear chains when he and Charlotte don't. I've explained that different rules apply to different people and that the boy's restraints are like a parent's loving guidance, maybe uncomfortable, but necessary for proper development. Marcus stopped reading, his fists clenched. The psychological manipulation was unbelievable. They were teaching the enslaved child that his shackles were a form of care, and teaching the white children that some people deserved chains while others deserved freedom, just because of their skin color. But Eleanor never wrote the enslaved child's name. In dozens of diary entries over several years, he was always the boy, or their little companion. This erasure was on purpose. Enslaved people weren't individuals with names and identities. They were property, described by what they did rather than who they were. Marcus needed to find the child's name. He requested the Hartwell plantation records from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Plantation ledgers often listed enslaved people by name, age, and the work they were assigned. If the child had been part of the Hartwell holdings, there would be a record. The ledgers arrived as digital scans, heavy leather-bound books filled with meticulous handwriting that documented the buying, selling, births, deaths, and work assignments of human beings who were treated like livestock. Marcus forced himself to read the dehumanizing language, looking for any child who might be the boy in the photograph. In the 1854 ledger under House Servants' Children, he found an entry that made him gasp. Samuel, male, approximately 9 years, assigned to children's companion and lighthouse duties. Mother Rose, deceased 1852. Father, unknown. Note, flight risk, secured as of December 1853. Samuel. The boy finally had a name. Marcus traced Samuel's presence in the Hartwell records from before and after 1854. The documentation was limited but devastating. Samuel had been born on the Hartwell plantation around 1845. His mother, Rose, had worked as a house servant until she died in 1852. The cause was listed simply as fever, but Marcus knew that term covered everything from cholera to exhaustion to violence. After Rose's death, 7-year-old Samuel had been assigned to work in the main house. The 1853 ledger noted, Samuel shows intelligence and obedience, assigned to attend Master William and Miss Charlotte, to assist with their needs and provide companionship. Well suited for this duty. The language was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. Samuel hadn't been invited to be the children's friend. He'd been assigned to them, his companionship a form of labor, his entire existence organized around serving white children who were barely older than him. The December 1853 entry about Samuel's attempted escape also appeared in the plantation ledger. Samuel apprehended 2 miles from property, attempting flight. 15 lashes administered. Fitted with wrist restraints to prevent future attempts. Restraints to remain until trustworthiness demonstrated. 15 lashes. Samuel had been 8 years old. Marcus found more references to Samuel through 1854 and 1855. The restraints remained on his wrists for at least 18 months, long enough to leave the permanent scarring that was visible in the photograph. During this time, he continued to be William and Charlotte's companion, playing with them, attending their lessons, and accompanying them on walks around the plantation grounds. The photograph from summer 1854 had been taken about 6 months after Samuel's escape attempt. Marcus studied the image again with this new knowledge. Samuel's smile now seemed even more obviously forced, the performance of a child who had learned that appearing cheerful was necessary to survive, and that showing the pain and terror he must have felt would lead to more punishment. The white children's casual affection, Charlotte's hand on Samuel's shoulder, William's comfortable closeness, also took on a different meaning. They probably did feel genuine affection for Samuel. Children that age form real bonds. But their affection existed entirely within a power structure where they owned Samuel, where their father could have him whipped or shackled or sold at any time, and where Samuel's needs, feelings, and identity were unimportant compared to their comfort and entertainment. In 1856, the ledger entries about Samuel changed tone. Samuel, age 11, becoming unsuitable for house service, shows increasing sullenness and resistance to instruction. Recommend reassignment to fieldwork. Marcus knew what this meant. As Samuel grew older, and as the trauma of his enslavement became more intense, it became impossible for him to keep up the performance of cheerful companionship. The Hartwells interpreted his natural human response to trauma as sullenness and resistance. The final entry about Samuel appeared in October 1856. Samuel sold to Mr. Thomas Crawford, plantation owner from Mississippi, for $650. Proceeds recorded. Samuel was 11 years old. He'd been sold away from the only home he'd ever known, from the graves of his mother and any other family he might have had, and sent to Mississippi alone. The ledger recorded this transaction with the same clinical detachment used for selling furniture or livestock. Marcus searched Mississippi plantation records, trying to track Samuel further, but the trail went cold. Enslaved people who were sold out of state were notoriously difficult to trace, and this was often done on purpose, because separation was used as both a punishment and a way to prevent family bonds from forming. Samuel disappeared into the historical void that had swallowed millions of enslaved people whose names, stories, and fates were never recorded, or were recorded only as property transactions. While Samuel's trail disappeared, Marcus could easily trace what happened to William and Charlotte Hartwell. Their lives were documented in newspapers, society announcements, wills, and family histories that were preserved by descendants who were proud of their heritage. William Hartwell grew up, went to the College of Charleston, and then managed his father's plantation operations until the Civil War. He served as an officer in the Confederate Army and returned home after the war to find that the family's wealth had been greatly diminished, but not destroyed. He rebuilt the plantation's prosperity by using exploitative labor contracts with freed black workers, a system that replicated many aspects of slavery under different legal structures. William married, had 5 children, and died in 1903 at age 53. His obituary remembered him as a pillar of Charleston society and a guardian of Southern heritage. Charlotte married into another wealthy plantation family at 18. She was known for her charity work, much of which, ironically, focused on helping the black community through organizations that taught subservience and compliance. She lived until 1911, dying at age 65. Her obituary praised her as a lady of refinement and Christian virtue. Neither William nor Charlotte, in any of their letters, diaries, or public statements that were preserved in archives, ever mentioned Samuel, the boy who had been their constant companion for years, who had appeared in photographs with them, and who had played with them every day while wearing shackles. He'd been completely erased from their memory, or at least from any record they left behind. Marcus found one exception, a letter William had written to his father in 1857, a year after Samuel was sold away. William, who was 13 at the time, was at boarding school and wrote, "I sometimes think about the boy who used to take care of me when I was younger. I wonder if he's doing well in his new situation. Mother wrote that you sold him to a planter in Mississippi. I hope he's being treated kindly there." The casual tone of the letter was shocking. Samuel's sale and separation, a trauma that probably destroyed what was left of Samuel's childhood, was reduced to a simple question of whether he was doing well, as if he had just changed jobs instead of being sold like livestock and sent away from everything he knew. Marcus discovered that the Hartwell family home still stood in Charleston, now divided into expensive condominiums. The plantation land had been sold off piece by piece over the decades, but the main house and about 10 acres remained, carefully preserved as an example of antebellum architecture. He also found that the Hartwell family had an active historical society that preserved family documents and promoted their ancestors' legacy. Their website had many photographs from the family's history, including formal portraits of James and Eleanor Hartwell and later images of William and Charlotte as adults. But the 1854 photograph of the 3 children wasn't among the family's preserved images. Someone had decided not to include it in the official family history, maybe because Samuel's presence and the visible shackle marks made the image uncomfortable, a reminder of realities that the family preferred to forget. Marcus needed to confront this history publicly to make sure Samuel wasn't erased again. He started planning an exhibition. 6 months after finding the photograph, Marcus was standing in the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, preparing for the opening of a new permanent exhibition, Childhood Under Slavery: The Hidden Truth in Family Photographs. The 1854 image of William, Charlotte, and Samuel was the main attraction. Marcus had worked with conservators to create a large reproduction that showed every detail, including digital enhancements that made the shackle marks on Samuel's wrists unmistakably clear. Next to the photograph were text panels that explained what viewers were seeing. This photograph was staged to present an image of innocent childhood friendship. The main panel read, "The 3 children are wearing expensive clothing and are posed together as if they were equals. But look closely at the wrists of the black child. The marks you see are scars from shackles, metal restraints that this 8-year-old boy was forced to wear after trying to escape slavery. This child, whose name was Samuel, wasn't playing with the white children by choice. He was assigned to them as property, forced to pretend to be their companion while enduring violence and captivity." The exhibition included Eleanor Hartwell's diary entries, which were displayed with documentation of Samuel's attempted escape, his punishment, and his eventual sale to Mississippi. Interactive displays allowed visitors to learn more about the full context, the Hartwell family's wealth, which was built on enslaved labor, the legal system that allowed children to be shackled and sold, and the deliberate erasure of enslaved people's names and identities from historical records. Marcus had also created a section that explored what happened to the three children as they got older. Visitors could see photographs of William and Charlotte as adults, read their obituaries, and learn about their prosperous and respected lives. Then they would come to a simple panel with Samuel's name and dates. Samuel, born approximately 1845, sold away from South Carolina in 1856, further fate unknown. The contrast was intentional and heartbreaking. Two children whose entire lives were documented and celebrated, and one child who vanished into historical silence. The exhibition's opening received significant media coverage. Major newspapers wrote articles about it, and NPR did an interview. But the most important response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the exhibition opened, Marcus received an email from a woman named Grace Morrison in Jackson, Mississippi. The subject line was, "I think I'm descended from the boy in your photograph." Marcus's hands shook as he opened the message. "My great-great-great-grandfather was a man named Samuel Rose," Grace wrote. Family history says he was born enslaved in South Carolina around 1845 and was sold to Mississippi as a child. After emancipation, he took his mother's name, Rose, as his last name. He lived until 1923 and told his children and grandchildren about his time in Charleston, about being forced to be a companion to white children while wearing chains. He specifically mentioned being photographed with those children. "My family has kept his story alive for generations. When I saw the news coverage of your exhibition, I immediately recognized his story." Marcus and Grace talked on the phone for 2 hours that evening. She was 63 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and the keeper of her family's oral history, which were stories that had been passed down through 5 generations from Samuel himself. "He was traumatized by those years in Charleston," Grace explained. "He told his daughter, my great-great-grandmother, that the worst part wasn't the physical violence, even though that was terrible. The worst part was being forced to pretend he loved his captors, being forced to smile and play and act cheerful with children who owned him and who could have him beaten or sold at any moment. He said it made him feel like he was betraying himself, erasing his own humanity to perform for white people's comfort." Samuel had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi in 1856, just as the Hartwell record showed. The plantation owner, Thomas Crawford, had Samuel working in the fields until the Civil War. After emancipation, Samuel had stayed in Mississippi, working as a sharecropper and then as a laborer on the railroads. He married, had 6 children, and lived to age 78. "He was bitter," Grace said quietly. "My great-great-grandmother said he rarely smiled as an adult. The performance of happiness he'd been forced to keep up as a child had permanently damaged his ability to feel genuine joy. He told his children that white people had stolen his childhood twice, first by enslaving him, and then again by forcing him to pretend that enslavement was acceptable, even pleasant." Grace had photographs of Samuel from later in his life. She sent them to Marcus by email. The images showed an elderly black man with a stern, weathered face, deep lines around his mouth, and eyes that held decades of accumulated pain. In every photograph, his hands were carefully positioned to show his wrists and the scars that still marked them 60 years after the shackles had been removed. "He insisted on that," Grace explained. "Whenever someone took his photograph, he made sure his wrist scars were visible. He said they were proof of what had been done to him, proof that couldn't be erased or denied. He wanted the evidence to survive." Marcus felt tears running down his face. Samuel had understood something important, that photographs could be used to erase the truth, like the 1854 image had tried to do by presenting slavery as something harmless and enslavers as kind people. But photographs could also preserve the truth if the subjects made sure to make their reality visible. Samuel's adult portraits, with their deliberate display of his scars, were a testament that countered the lie of the childhood photograph. Grace had more to share. Samuel talked about those white children specifically. He said the girl, Charlotte, used to cry when he was punished. She'd beg her parents not to hurt him, but she never tried to actually help him escape or oppose slavery itself. She just didn't want to see the violence that kept the system she benefited from going. Samuel said that kind of selective sympathy was almost worse than outright cruelty. It made white people feel virtuous while doing nothing to change the conditions that caused suffering. Grace had preserved other family stories, too. Samuel had tried to find his extended family after emancipation, but he discovered that most of them had been sold away from the Hartwell plantation before the war. He spent decades searching for siblings, cousins, aunts, and his uncles placed advertisements in black newspapers and wrote letters to churches and aid societies, all in an effort to find his immediate family. He had managed to locate some distant relatives, but he never managed to reconnect with the core members of his family. Slavery scattered them so badly that those family bonds just couldn't be reestablished. "The Hartwell family destroyed my family," Grace said, her voice breaking with emotion. "They didn't just enslave my ancestors. They deliberately separated them, sold them away from each other, completely erased their connections, as well as their histories, and then they meticulously preserved their own family's history. They carefully constructed a narrative of the South, celebrating themselves as these genteel Southerners while at the same time trying to erase any and all evidence of the brutality they inflicted upon those they enslaved." Marcus was keenly aware of the crucial next step. Grace's family history absolutely had to be integrated into the exhibition. It was critically important to present her narrative right alongside the photograph. This juxtaposition would make sure that viewers understood that the nameless child in the image had a life, a future, and descendants who continued to carry his story forward. News of the exhibition, and more specifically, Grace's direct connection to Samuel, eventually made its way to Charleston. The response from the Hartwell family was both immediate and quite defensive. A woman by the name of Catherine Hartwell Bennett, who was the great-granddaughter of William Hartwell, sent Marcus a very lengthy email. He found the contents of this email to be both completely predictable and deeply infuriating. "While we do acknowledge our family's complicated history," Catherine wrote, "we believe that your exhibition presents a very unbalanced and anachronistic view of the past. The Hartwell family provided housing, food, and essential care for the enslaved people on their property, which included the child in the photograph. Our ancestors were just products of their time, operating within legal and social systems that they didn't create. To judge them by modern standards is simply unfair and harmful to our family's lasting legacy." The letter continued on, arguing that the photograph actually served as concrete evidence of the Hartwell family's inherent kindness. She emphasized that they had allowed Samuel to dress well, to receive an education right alongside their own children, and had even allowed him to be photographed as if he were their equal. Catherine even went so far as to suggest that the shackles Marcus had identified might have been either greatly exaggerated or even completely misinterpreted, proposing the idea that perhaps they were some other kind of mark or just a strange photographic anomaly. Marcus responded with a meticulously detailed email, including very high-resolution images of the scars that were on Samuel's wrists, excerpts from Eleanor Hartwell's own diary entries that specifically described Samuel's restraints, and plantation records that documented his punishment and eventual sale. He also very thoughtfully included Grace's contact information, suggesting that Catherine might want to hear directly from Samuel's own descendants regarding the true impact of her ancestors' so-called kindness. Catherine never responded directly to that email. Instead, she posted a statement on the Hartwell Family Historical Society's website, expressing her deep disappointment that certain activists were using historical photographs as a means to shame and attack families, rather than to promote reconciliation and understanding. This statement, unsurprisingly, provoked very strong reactions online. Historians were extremely quick to point out that acknowledging historical atrocities was not an attack at all. It was, in fact, truth-telling, which was absolutely necessary for genuine understanding and reconciliation. Activists noted that the Hartwell family's desire for reconciliation seemed to require absolutely no accountability or acknowledgement of any harm on their part, but simply a request that the descendants of enslaved people cease bringing up uncomfortable truths from the past. The ensuing controversy, however, ended up driving even more visitors to the exhibition. News outlets covered the dispute extensively, and the photograph of Samuel with William and Charlotte became very widely recognized, no longer as just a charming image of childhood innocence, but as very real documentary evidence of the psychological cruelty of slavery and the lengths to which enslavers would go to normalize and disguise their inherent violence. Marcus then arranged for Grace to fly to Montgomery. He felt that it was vitally important for her to see the exhibition firsthand, to stand directly before the photograph of her ancestor and know, without a single doubt, that his story was finally being told, that his name was finally being spoken aloud, and that his survival and resistance were finally being honored. When Grace walked into the exhibition space and saw the very large-scale reproduction of the 1854 photograph, she stopped abruptly and began to weep openly and uncontrollably. Marcus stood beside her silently, giving her all the space she needed to feel whatever she was feeling in that moment. "He's so young," Grace whispered finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I've always known the story, but seeing his actual face, seeing how small he was, and seeing those terrible marks on his wrists, it's just different. He was just a baby and they actually tortured him. They bought him and sold him just like he was a piece of furniture. They erased his name and his mother's memory and his entire humanity." She reached out and gently touched the image of Samuel's face, her fingers trembling slightly. "But he survived," she continued, her voice still thick with emotion, but now laced with fierce pride. "He lived through it. He had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we're still here because of him. We remember him always. They tried so hard to erase him from history, but he's actually more permanent than all their monuments and mansions put together. His truth has outlasted all of their lies." Marcus then spent the following months diligently expanding his research, searching for other photographs that might document enslaved children in similar situations. What he uncovered was a very disturbing pattern. Dozens and dozens of images, spanning all the way from the 1840s through the 1860s, depicted white children posed right alongside enslaved children, often dressed in similar clothing, and positioned in ways that were clearly meant to suggest friendship or even equality. These photographs, he realized with a sinking feeling, served a very specific and carefully calculated propaganda purpose. They were deliberately created to directly counter all of those abolitionist claims that slavery was inherently cruel and dehumanizing. Enslavers commissioned these photographs, showing enslaved children well-dressed and seemingly happy as proof that slavery was, in fact, benign, that enslaved people were actually treated as valued members of the family, and that the anti-slavery movement was simply exaggerating conditions in the South. However, when Marcus examined these images much more closely, particularly high-resolution digital copies that revealed details that were often invisible in the original prints, he found a wealth of evidence that directly contradicted the intended message that the enslavers were trying to send. Enslaved children's bodies often bore very clear signs of malnutrition, physical injury, or chronic stress. Their postures often demonstrated extreme weariness, resignation to their terrible fate, and constant tension. And in some cases, as in Samuel's photograph, the physical evidence of violence was literally visible right there on their bodies for anyone to see. Marcus then partnered with other researchers to create a comprehensive database of all of these photographs, meticulously documenting exactly when and where they were taken, and identifying both the enslaved families and, whenever it was at all possible, the enslaved individuals who were depicted in the images. They worked very closely with genealogists and descendants of enslaved people to trace names and stories, effectively pulling people back from the very brink of complete historical erasure. Grace became deeply involved in this important work, helping to connect researchers with other families who held invaluable oral histories about their enslaved ancestors. Through this ever-expanding network, Marcus discovered 2 more photographs containing images of Samuel, both of which had been taken at the Hartwell plantation well before his sale in 1856. One photograph showed him at approximately age 7, standing directly behind Eleanor Hartwell in a very formal family portrait. He was dressed in shabby, ill-fitting clothes, and stood with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his expression completely blank and unreadable. This image actually predated his attempted escape from slavery, so it was before the shackles. But even at that young age, his body language already showed the practiced subservience of a child who is intimately acquainted with violence and fear. The second photograph was taken in 1855, approximately 1 year after the garden bench image. In this one, Samuel stood completely alone, photographed against the stark and unforgiving backdrop of a plantation outbuilding wall. He was dressed in the same type of fine clothing as before, but his wrists were clearly visible, the shackles still in place a full year after his escape attempt had failed. His face held no hint of a smile whatsoever, just a direct, haunted stare directly at the camera's lens. Grace wept uncontrollably when Marcus showed her these additional images of Samuel. "They documented everything they did to him," she said, her voice choked with emotion and rising with anger. "They actually photographed him in chains and didn't even see how it completely contradicted the story they were trying to tell the world. They were so utterly convinced of their own righteousness that they simply couldn't see the glaring truth that their own photographs preserved for posterity." Marcus included all 3 photographs of Samuel in an expanded version of the exhibition. He arranged them chronologically, showcasing Samuel's gradual transformation from a weary but unrestrained 7-year-old to a shackled 8-year-old forced to feign happiness for the camera, to a haunted-looking 11-year-old whose face clearly showed the accumulated trauma of years and years of captivity and abuse. The exhibition also very poignantly featured the photographs from Samuel's adult life, depicting the elderly man he had become, deliberately displaying his scars for all to see, and refusing to allow viewers to look away from what had been done to him.